Hey, I'm Chris. I'm the pastor at Compass, and I'm super glad that you carved out some time to join me today. So recently I saw a news report about COVID testing and vaccines, and I thought that it was really interesting, and so I wanted to share it with you. So check this out.
AI 앵커가 전하는 MBN 주요 뉴스입니다. 어제 코로나19 확진자가 61명 나왔습니다. 신규 확진이 사흘째 두 자릿수를 기록했는데 방역 당국은 안심하긴 이르다고 말했습니다.
Okay, that was in Korean, so you probably didn't understand what they were saying, but that's okay, because the content of this story isn't really what I wanted you to see. I wanted you to see the newscaster, because she isn't real. I mean, technically she's a real person, but the entire newscast that you just saw was a deep fake. It looked like a real person, but it was a digital fake of both her image and her voice. And there are deep fakes all over the internet. Look at this one.
Isn't it a place you can get to by a boat or a train? Is far, far away. Behind the moon. Beyond the rain. Somewhere over the rainbow. Way up high. There's a land that I heard of once in a lullaby. Somewhere over the rainbow, boobies fly. Boobs fly over the rainbow. Why then? Oh, why can't I?
I don't think I'll ever see The Wizard of Oz the same way again. But the point is that we live in a world where the dividing line between what's real and what's fake has never been more unclear. I mean, just take social media, for example. It's a place where we get to go and present a curated version of ourselves to the world, even if that version doesn't totally line up with reality or the reality of who we are. A recent survey of 2,000 Americans, it found that 46% of Gen Z say their personality online vastly differs from how they present themselves to the real world. Almost half of them are living a double life between what's on screen and off screen. And honestly, it's not just Generation Z, it's all of us. Because of this muddiness between what's real and what's fake, it's easy to believe things or say things, even to be things that aren't true. There are whole industries that benefit from getting us to believe in their version of the world, whether it's true or not. There's a spiritual divide too. There are a lot of people who have recently come to believe that the vision of God they were taught their whole lives is at best incomplete and at worst totally fake. Or they found that the lives of the spiritual leaders that they trusted to shape their perception of God, that those people's lives were very different behind the curtain than what they presented to the world. There was a gap between who they were and who we thought they were. And there's a word for this gap between real and fake: hypocrisy. And it's something that Jesus confronted directly and pretty aggressively. And we're going to take the next several weeks as we walk through Matthew chapter 23 to see Jesus at his most confrontational as he takes on the religious hypocrisy of the Pharisees. And so we're going to start today in Matthew 23, verse 1. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The teachers of religious law and the Pharisees are the official interpreters of the law of Moses. So practice and obey whatever they tell you." So for the last few chapters of Matthew, we've been following Jesus as he's been in the temple, and he's been criticizing the priests and religious leaders. And at first he used stories and subtext, a little subtle, but as their attacks on him became more direct, so did his responses. Which makes it strange to see him telling the crowds to do everything the Pharisees say to do. Because until now, Jesus has told his followers how the Pharisees were wrong and not to be like them, which seems like it would include not doing what they say. So what does he mean by this? Well, to understand what Jesus is doing here, we need to talk about something he references. This is the seat of Moses. It was a seat usually made of stone that sat at the front of every synagogue. And when the people would gather, the synagogue leader or the teacher who was there who had the most authority, they would go up front and they would sit in this chair to teach. In our world, preachers and teachers, they usually stand to get the attention of their audience. But then rabbis would sit in the seat of Moses. But the seat wasn't just there for the comfort of the teachers. It was a symbol. It represented Moses, the lawgiver, the person to whom God gave his commandments. And when someone sat in that seat, they represented more than themselves. They represented the system of Jewish law and Moses himself. A good way for us to think about this is the presidency. Most people respect the office of president. And even if we find the person occupying it totally reprehensible, we still respect the position. George Washington held that office. And so it's worthy of respect, even if we think the person occupying it isn't. The seat of Moses was the same. It held authority and commanded respect, even if the person sitting in it didn't. And so when someone speaks from it, you listen and you observe out of respect for the position. And Jesus begins his address to the crowd, telling them that the seat is worthy of honor, regardless of who sits there. But he continues in verse 2. It says, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees are official interpreters of the law of Moses. So practice and obey whatever they tell you. But don't follow their example, for they don't practice what they teach. If you grew up in church at all, you know by default that the Pharisees were hypocrites, that they were bad guys. This is Church Basics 101. Don't be like the Pharisees. But this was probably a strange and shocking thing for Jesus to say back then. I mean, he'd already affirmed the authority of the seat of Moses, where the Pharisees often sat to teach. And the people, they recognized that authority, and they held the Pharisees in high regard as the primary authorities on Scripture. Not only that, the Pharisees were known for their strict obedience to the law. They publicly performed these acts of obedience for everyone to see. And so in the view of the people, the Pharisees were the experts on interpreting the law and the experts in living it out. So how are the Pharisees not practicing the law they preached? Let's continue in verse 2 again. The teachers of religious law and the Pharisees are the official interpreters of the law of Moses, so practice and obey whatever they tell you, but don't follow their example, for they don't practice what they teach. And this is what he says next. They crush people with unbearable religious demands. According to Jesus, there are a couple things that make up the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. And the first is that they burden people with heavy and overbearing loads to carry. And what is the weight that they are crushing people with? It's the law itself, at least their interpretation of the law. This is what they preached, the regulations and rituals of the law. They preached the religious rules and demanded that the people follow every one of them down to the smallest detail, or else be marginalized to the edge of society as an unclean sinner. The hypocrisy of the Pharisees began with them placing the burdensome load of dogmatic religion on people's backs and then forcing them to carry it. Look at how Peter talks about this in Acts chapter 15. He says, now then, why do you try to test God by putting on the necks of Gentiles a yoke that neither we nor our ancestors have been able to bear? Echoing the language of Jesus, the Apostle Peter calls the weight of this kind of religion unbearable. And the first part of the hypocrisy of the Pharisees was to load people up with the unbearable demands of this type of religion. But Jesus continues. Look what he says in verse 4. They crush people with unbearable religious demands and never lift a finger to ease the burden. According to Jesus, the hypocrisy of the Pharisees was first to load people up with the unbearable burden of the 613 commands of the Jewish scriptures, and then to do nothing to help them. They would say, here are the rules, Purity is obeying all the rules. Impurity is disobeying even one of them. So be holy or be excluded from life in the community. Can you imagine the weight of that? That if you don't get everything right, you are impure, and no impurity can be allowed among God's people. Now imagine that same life without any mercy, grace, or support, only judgment and shame. Maybe you don't have to imagine it. Maybe you've experienced it. Maybe you've been part of religious environments where the bar to inclusion was just too high for you to meet. The expectations of your leaders were so heavy that you just couldn't carry them. You couldn't fit the mold, and the result was that you were pushed out. Or maybe you were just treated so poorly it became impossible for you to stay. And if that's you, can I tell you, that's not Jesus' way. This is Jesus' way in Matthew 11:28. This is what he says. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, my burden is light. The way of the Pharisees is to make people carry the unbearable weight of legalism. But the way of Jesus is to invite people to carry a burden that is light, a burden that actually gives us rest when we carry it. And the irony is that Jesus' burden, it comes from the same place as the Pharisees, the Jewish scriptures. The religion the Pharisees taught was the explicit following of the 613 rules found in Scripture. But the religion of Jesus was the explicit following of two. Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. The heavy burden of the Pharisee is legalism, but the easy burden of Jesus is love. A few weeks ago, I was talking to someone about all this, and they told me a story from the church that they grew up in. There's this young family that started attending this church, and they made the decision to become followers of Jesus. Awesome. And they started to see this immediate transformation as God began working in their lives. And one change they wanted to make was to get married. See, even though they'd lived together for a long time and they had children together, they'd never gotten married. And so they told their pastor that they wanted to take this step of faith in their journey to follow Jesus. And they asked him if he would do the ceremony. And the pastor said this. He said, I'd be happy to do it, but on one condition. We believe that God's design for sex is within the confines of marriage. So I'll marry you, but first I need one of you to move out for 3 months so that you can show your obedience to God. And then you can get married and you can stay part of our church. This pastor said they were living a life of impurity, and the only way to make that right was to break up their family for 3 months, to take the father of young children away from them in order to be in line with the rules of religion. They crush people with unbearable religious demands and never lift a finger to ease the burden. Here's a couple who want to take what they believe is a step of obedience toward God to be more like Jesus. And in response, a religious leader placed an unbearable load on their back and was unwilling to help move it. This is the hypocrisy of the Pharisee. Telling people to come to God by following the legalistic demands of religion and doing nothing to ease the burden when they can't. But that's not the way of Jesus. The way of Jesus is love. The way of Jesus is not to ask, what do the religious commands say? His way is to ask, what does love dictate? Because like he said, if we love well, we don't have to worry about hundreds of other commands. If we love well, the demands of the law are satisfied. So how do we avoid the hypocrisy of the Pharisees? How do we avoid falling into the trap of legalism? Well, we can start by regularly asking ourselves one question. Does this feel like the easy burden of love or the heavy burden of legalism? How we answer should dictate what we do next. And this doesn't mean that we have to water down what we think is right. It just means that perhaps we need to rethink how we respond to people. For example, we can demand celibacy from those whose sexual ethic is different than ours. Or we can encourage them to take the step from promiscuity to monogamy and from monogamy to marriage. Which one of those feels like legalism and which one feels like love? We can demand that abortion be outlawed and that anyone who takes part in it be punished. Or we can support the mothers who give birth by helping them out of poverty and helping their children have access to the food, education, and resources they need in order to live flourishing lives, believing that our responsibility to the life of that child doesn't end when they're born. Which one feels like legalism and which one feels like love? You may be hearing this, and God is showing you that you tend to respond to people in legalism more than love. And the good news is that the biggest step in overcoming our religious hypocrisy is simply seeing it. And for you to recognize that you need to turn toward love, that's a huge thing. You should be commended for it. And I want to encourage you to keep asking yourself if your reaction to people feels like love or legalism. And then let God guide you to the answer. Ask him to help you love like Jesus, because he will. If you're hearing this and you aren't a follower of Jesus, but you've been trying so hard to be a good person, or maybe you are a follower of Jesus, but you've been carrying the unbearable load of legalistic religion, you can be free of all of that. Jesus wants to take that heavy pack off your back and replace it with one that is light and easy. One that won't make you weary in your efforts to be good, but one that will actually give you rest. And I encourage you to say yes to his invitation today. May we be people of love, not legalism, who constantly ask ourselves if our response to people feels like the easy burden of love or if it feels like the heavy burden of legalism. And in our genuinely love, may Jesus be more visible to the world. And as a result, may people in our lives say yes to his invitation to a life where the yoke is easy and the burden is light. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.